Welcome to this essential explainer on Norman England. We're looking at the crucial years from 1066 to 1088. This is where the dust settles on the conquest, and William actually turns a military victory into a functioning, long-lasting system of rule. Okay, let's dive right in. Here's our exact roadmap for this GCSE masterclass. 1. The Feudal System and Church. 2. Norman government. 3. The Norman Aristocracy. And 4. William I and the Succession. We're covering these 4 modules efficiently, zero digressions. Let's go.
Module 1. The Feudal System and Church.
So the absolute core of this new hierarchy was a concept you absolutely must memorize: the Tenants-in-Chief. Basically, these were elite nobles granted land directly by the king. You see, after the conquest, William literally owned all the land in England, all of it. But he couldn't defend it alone, right? So he leased out these massive estates to his key followers. But make no mistake, this was a strict transaction, definitely not a gift. In return for this vast land, they owed direct military service to the crown. These tenants-in-chief would then grant land further down the social ladder to under-tenants and knights, which created this incredibly strict, highly organized pyramid of power. Now, this whole pyramid was held together by some very strict obligations. First up was homage. This was a formal, genuinely sacred pledge of loyalty where a vassal would actually kneel down and swear an oath on holy relics to be faithful to his lord. It was a huge deal. Second, you have knight service. This was the totally non-negotiable requirement for a lord to provide equipped, highly trained cavalry soldiers for the king's army, usually for about 40 days a year. And then, right at the bottom of the pyramid, labor service. That was the relentless, backbreaking agricultural work provided by the peasants. That's what ensured the upper levels of the hierarchy stayed incredibly wealthy. Okay, so a crucial question: what actually happens if you break these rules? Well, the concept you need to know here is forfeiture. If a tenant failed in their obligations or, dared to rebel, they faced forfeiture, meaning William simply took their land away and handed it to someone more loyal. Since all land ultimately belonged to the king anyway, total obedience meant vast wealth, but rebellion, that meant absolute ruin. But this systemic restructuring wasn't just about land and soldiers. It completely transformed the English church too. This massive shift is perfectly illustrated by the removal of the corrupt Anglo-Saxon Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand. He was ousted in favor of a strict, highly educated Norman reformer named Lanfranc. And Lanfranc didn't waste any time. He introduced church courts and totally centralized religious authority. Suddenly, the church's staggering wealth, its massive landholdings, and its daily social influence over the population were firmly tied directly to Norman royal power.
Now listen closely, because this is exactly how you unlock top marks. For your exams, remember you have to balance any extent of change questions. Yes, you absolutely must show the dramatic feudal shifts at the very top of society, like replacing English earls with Norman tenants-in-chief and new archbishops. But you have to balance that against the continuing, everyday reality for ordinary people. For your average peasant, farming the local fields, paying the exact same taxes, and trading at the village market, that largely continued just as it had before 1066. Showing both the massive change at the top and the continuity at the bottom, well, that demonstrates a really nuanced historical understanding.
Moving on to Module 2, Norman government. So Anglo-Saxon earls used to have this immense, semi-independent regional power. But William, he intentionally crushed that system to centralize control. Instead, he heavily utilized regents. These were trusted men who practically ruled England with full royal authority during his really frequent absences over in Normandy. He also massively expanded the power of the sheriffs, basically turning them into aggressive royal administrators who enforced the king's will locally in the shires. On top of that, the king directly held vast tracts of land called the demesne, just to ensure he was, without a doubt, the richest man in the country. And finally, he imposed harsh, deeply unpopular laws over the newly created royal forests. These were massive hunting reserves where Norman law literally overrode local custom, and the punishments for poaching, truly brutal, like blinding. But the absolute crowning achievement of this administrative grip is the Domesday Book. Just think of the sheer scale of this. In 1086, it provided an exhaustive county-by-county, village-by-village record of land, livestock, and resources. William actually sent commissioners across the entire country because he needed to know exactly who owned what, literally down to the last cow and pig. And why? So he could tax his brand new kingdom with ruthless mathematical efficiency.
Never forget this crucial tip. The Domesday Book is your absolute star witness. It is your ultimate piece of concrete evidence to prove the sheer ambition and effectiveness of Norman government. If an examiner ever asks you about Norman power, royal administration, or how William secured his kingdom financially, the Domesday Survey is your undeniable proof. Hit the nail on the head with that one.
Module 3, the Norman Aristocracy. Now, if you want to know exactly how the new elite operated, look no further than Bishop Odo rallying Duke William's troops right in the heat of battle. Odo was William's half-brother, he was the exceptionally wealthy Earl of Kent, and yes, he was a senior bishop. This singular guy embodies the complete, total overlap of Norman culture, church authority, and violent military might. This new Norman aristocracy spoke French, they built intimidating stone castles, and they basically formed a tiny exclusive club at the top of English society that completely excluded the native population.
In an exam setting, you should really treat Bishop Odo as prime historical evidence. Use him to demonstrate the massive concentration of family, political, and church power in just one individual. He shows exactly how the Norman system aggressively stripped power away from the English and concentrated it into the hands of a few really well-connected Norman men. To put that into perspective, out of all the land in England, roughly half was held by just 190 of William's closest followers. A real game changer.
And our final module, number 4, William I and the Succession.
The timeline of William's later years tells a pretty dramatic story of intense internal fracture. Between 1077 and 1080, William faced a major, deeply personal revolt from his own eldest son and heir, Robert. Robert felt publicly disrespected, and he demanded genuine authority and territory in Normandy. This bitter family tension ultimately culminated in 1087 with the unexpected death of William I. And that triggered an immediate, incredibly messy disputed succession in 1088 that genuinely threatened to tear the entire Anglo-Norman kingdom apart.
William's death in 1087 created a massive, immediate power vacuum. History actually tells us that his barons abandoned his corpse, literally just left it there, to rush back and secure their own castles. A complex, brutal feudal system that had been held together almost entirely by the terrifying personal authority of one single man was now suddenly tested to its absolute limits. The resulting succession in 1088 was fiercely contested, to say the least. William's second surviving son, William Rufus, stepped up and claimed the English throne, but he could only secure it by successfully putting down a massive joint rebellion. And guess who led this rebellion? His older brother Robert and his uncle Bishop Odo. The Norman elite, who had spent 20 solid years dominating the English, were suddenly warring amongst themselves. It got so bad that William Rufus actually had to appeal to English soldiers to help him defeat his own Norman barons. No way, right? Now, for a top-grade analysis, you really need to connect the dots across the entire time period. Explicitly point out how the succession crisis of 1088 mirrors the exact same themes that started this whole depth study back in 1066. In both of these years, you have a dead king, violently disputed claims to the throne, extremely nervous nobles picking sides, and a resolution that only comes through brutal military conflict. It's like history repeating itself perfectly. So, I leave you with this ultimate exam question. To synthesize everything we've covered today, how far had England been transformed by Norman rule by 1088? To build a really brilliant answer, you must weave together the feudal restructuring of lands via Tenants-in-Chief, the ruthlessly centralized government proven by the Domesday Book, and the deep cultural divides of the new aristocracy. Avoid those one-dimensional answers focused only on castles. Look at the whole shebang. What really changed for the people living in it? Think about that, and you'll absolutely master this topic. But honestly, ask yourself, how long could a system built entirely on fear and force actually survive once the conqueror was gone?